They were marching east, and most of them knew it meant death. In the last months of the war, tens of thousands of German soldiers laid down their weapons and surrendered to the Red Army. Some had fought until the last bullet. Others simply collapsed from exhaustion. Their choice was no longer between victory and defeat. It was between capture or being shot on the spot. And for German soldiers in 1945, capture in the East was almost a death sentence. German troops had learned by 1944 that surrendering in the West could mean survival. In American and British camps, prisoners were getting bread, meat, even cigarettes. Some were allowed to play football or attend classes. News of this spread quickly across the front. But in the East, the name Siberia was whispered like a curse. Everyone knew the story of Stalingrad. 90,000 men had surrendered there in 1943. Fewer than 6,000 ever came back. The rest disappeared into the endless Soviet system of camps. By 1945, every German soldier understood the rule. If you are taken prisoner in the East, you will never return. For Red Army soldiers, the sight of German uniforms brought rage. They had seen their villages burn, their families murdered, their neighbors shot. There are countless accounts of Germans who tried to surrender only to be beaten, stripped, or executed on the spot. Others were forced to march barefoot through snow and mud, watched over by soldiers who felt no sympathy. And yet, Stalin demanded prisoners alive. He saw them as useful for propaganda, for forced labor, for rebuilding the Soviet Union. The result was grim. Columns of tens of thousands were pushed eastward, guarded by men who hated them, toward destinations they did not even know. Survivors recalled columns stretching for miles. Wounded men stumbled with bloody bandages. Some carried only a photograph, a piece of bread, or nothing at all. Civilians spat at them, threw stones, screamed curses. Many had lost everything at the hands of the German army. Now they watched the invaders humbled, broken, starving. The prisoners themselves had no illusions. Some whispered, "Better to be dead than to go east." But there was no choice. No one told them where they were going. The word Siberia spread from mouth to mouth. Endless snow, wolves, frozen camps where no one returned. Some believed they would simply be executed once the train stopped. At the rail stations, the reality came. Boxcars, the same cattle wagons used for animals, stood waiting. Hundreds of men were crammed inside. The doors slammed shut. For many, that was the last time they saw the sky of Europe. This was only the beginning. The real ordeal had not even started. What awaited them beyond the Urals was not a prison in the usual sense. It was slow death by hunger, disease, and exhaustion. And it began with the journey itself, the transport to the east. The train ride east became the first graveyard. German soldiers, packed into wooden cattle cars, discovered that survival could be decided before even reaching the camps. The wagons were sealed tight, no windows, little air. Inside, 200 men or more were squeezed together, standing or crouching for days. There was almost no food. A crust of bread, maybe a ladle of thin soup, often nothing at all. Water was even rarer. Men licked condensation from the frozen walls or pressed snow into their mouths when guards briefly opened the doors. The air grew heavy with the stench of sweat, urine, and death. Survivors described the cattle cars as rolling coffins. At every stop, guards opened the doors to drag out bodies. Dozens had died overnight from hunger, thirst, or suffocation. The corpses were dumped onto the tracks, left in the snow like trash. Then the doors slammed shut again, and the train rolled on. Some prisoners tried to keep count of the days. After a week, they lost track. The endless rattle of wheels blurred time. For many, the journey lasted 2, 3, even 4 weeks. By the time they arrived in Siberia or Kazakhstan, entire wagons were nearly empty, most of their passengers dead. For German soldiers, this was almost beyond comprehension. Many of them had lived on army rations during the war, thin, but still food. Some had grown up in cities where bread and meat were normal parts of life. Now they were reduced to gnawing on boots, chewing bark, fighting over a drop of water. Letters smuggled home later spoke of this nightmare. The train was worse than any battle. At least on the front you could fight. Here, you only waited to die. Soviet civilians saw the trains too. At stations across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, they watched endless columns of boxcars filled with Germans. Some spat at the trains, shouting, "Murderers! Fascists!" Others felt a grim satisfaction. These were the men who had burned their villages, starved their families. Now they looked like skeletons already. And yet a few pitied them. Survivors remembered Soviet women throwing a potato, a piece of bread toward the wagons. Guards often beat such people away. The prisoners were not to be shown mercy. Inside the wagons, sanity cracked. Men fought each other for crumbs. Others gave up, lying down to die. Some tried to encourage their comrades, whispering that the war would end soon and they would be freed. But as the days dragged on, hope collapsed. One account tells of a soldier carving into the wooden wall with a nail, "I will not see home again." That message, scratched in the dark, was his last act before death. At last, the trains screeched to a halt. The doors were thrown open, and daylight blinded the prisoners. They stumbled out into landscapes they had never imagined. Endless snow, frozen forests, desolate steppes. The names were foreign: Sverdlovsk, Vorkuta, Karaganda. What greeted them was not rescue. It was only the beginning. Emaciated men were lined up, beaten into columns, and marched again, this time into the gates of Soviet POW camps. Behind barbed wire, the real ordeal began. For the Germans, the transport alone had killed thousands. But the camps would kill many more. Hunger, cold, and endless labor awaited. This was no temporary captivity. It was a system designed to grind men down slowly until only a fraction would ever see Germany again. And that takes us to the next chapter: life inside the Soviet POW camps. When the prisoners finally staggered off the trains, they discovered that the transport had only been the prologue. What awaited them inside the camps was not simply captivity. It was a slow-motion destruction of body and mind. The Soviet Union had prepared no comfortable barracks. Many camps were improvised, thrown together on frozen ground or in abandoned villages. The new arrivals were shoved behind barbed wire and told to survive with whatever scraps existed. The first impression was always the same: cold, mud, and hunger. In the summer, camps were swamps of filth. In the winter, they were frozen deserts where temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Men were issued thin, torn uniforms, sometimes nothing more than rags from their old army coats. Boots were often taken away. Some received wooden clogs that shattered in snow. The barracks, when they existed, were wooden huts without insulation. Dozens of men crammed into one room, sleeping on straw or bare planks. Lice spread instantly. Fleas and rats were constant companions. The greatest shock came at mealtime. A prisoner might receive 200 grams of bread per day, barely enough to keep a child alive. The bread was often mixed with sawdust or flour substitutes. Soup was water with a few cabbage leaves or potato peels floating on top. Meat was non-existent. Men grew thinner by the week. Hunger gnawed at them every hour. Survivors later wrote that the sound of chewing haunted the barracks. Men dreamed of bread, of potatoes, of anything to fill the void. Some chewed leather belts or gnawed on bark. The camps were not idle prisons. They were engines of labor. Every morning the Germans were marched out to work sites, mines, quarries, forests, construction projects. Even the weak and sick were driven forward with rifle butts. Prisoners cut timber in the Siberian taiga, carried stones until their backs broke, dug canals in the frozen ground. The workdays lasted 12, sometimes 14 hours. Rest was almost non-existent. Food was tied to performance. Work more, maybe get an extra ladle of soup, collapse, and get nothing. It was a vicious cycle. Starvation made men too weak to work, and weakness meant less food, which only accelerated death. Within weeks, disease spread like wildfire: dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis. With no medicine, no real doctors, the sick were left to rot. Barracks reeked of excrement and fever. Men lay on straw, trembling, waiting for death. The dead were dragged out each morning. In some camps, wagons carried piles of bodies to mass graves beyond the fence. In others, corpses were left in the snow until burial was possible. Prisoners spoke of the death look, a blank stare in the eyes of men who had given up. Once a man had that look, he rarely lasted more than a few days. Some tried to keep hope alive. They whispered prayers, sang quiet songs, shared memories of home. Others scratched notes on scraps of paper, hiding them in boots or under planks, hoping one day their words would be found. But hope was fragile. Every day, new names vanished. Every week, barracks grew emptier. For many Germans, the bitterest truth was comparison. They had heard rumors of their comrades in America and Britain, eating real bread, playing sports, writing letters home. In Soviet camps, they starved in rags, cut timber until they collapsed, and lived among lice and corpses. The contrast was unbearable. It was as if two different wars were being fought, one where prisoners lived like humans, another where they died like shadows. By the end of their first months in captivity, most understood the reality. This was not temporary imprisonment. It was not a pause until the war ended. This was survival against impossible odds. And yet, even in this hell, some clung to life, because the alternative was simply to lie down in the snow and never rise again. Next, we turn to the cruel statistics, the sheer scale of death that swept through the camps, claiming hundreds of thousands of men. Death in the Soviet camps was not sudden. It did not come from bullets or bombs, but from a slow erosion of the body. Hunger hollowed the men out. Disease ate at them day by day. Exhaustion stripped away their strength. And in the end, many simply lay down in the snow and never rose again. Every morning began with the same ritual, the count. Prisoners were lined up in the freezing air. Guards barked numbers. And each day, some men were missing. Their bodies lay stiff in the barracks, frozen overnight. Others had died at work sites, collapsing in the forest or at the quarry. Corpses were dragged onto sledges or wagons, hauled beyond the wire and dumped into shallow pits. In winter, the ground was too hard to dig, so the bodies were stacked like logs until spring. Prisoners marched past these piles daily, staring at their own likely future. Hunger was the most merciless killer. 200 grams of bread a day, a watery soup with cabbage leaves. It was starvation by design. Men grew skeletal. Their cheeks sank, ribs jutted out, eyes burned with fever. Those who could still work sometimes stole scraps, potato peels, rotten turnips, even grass. Some boiled leather belts to chew the fibers. In the darkest cases, prisoners turned on each other. Survivors whispered about cannibalism, though it remained a taboo no one wanted to admit. One German soldier later wrote, "I feared hunger more than bullets. A bullet kills you once. Hunger kills you every day." Disease finished what hunger began. Dysentery spread through the barracks like fire. Without soap or medicine, filth was everywhere. Typhus raged in the lice-infested huts. Tuberculosis ate through lungs. Even a cut could turn septic and kill. There were no real hospitals. A sick barrack meant a room where the dying were dumped together. Once sent there, few ever came back. Veterans of the camps described a chilling phenomenon, the death look. It was the moment when a prisoner's eyes went blank, when his will to fight simply vanished. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped moving. Within days, he was gone. Others watched with horror as their comrades faded away. They tried to shake them, feed them, drag them to work. But once the death look appeared, survival was almost impossible. The statistics were staggering. Of the 3.15 million German soldiers captured by the Soviet Union, over 1 million never returned. In some camps, mortality reached 30 to 35%. Entire groups of prisoners vanished within months. At Stalingrad, 90,000 had surrendered. By 1955, fewer than 6,000 came home. The rest were consumed by hunger, disease, and labor. It was one of the greatest prisoner death tolls in modern history. And yet, some did survive. They survived by luck, by cunning, by stubborn will. Some found ways to barter, a scrap of food for labor, a piece of clothing for a favor. Others banded together, sharing every crumb, protecting each other from despair. Survivors later said the secret wasn't strength, but the refusal to give up. One soldier recalled, "The strongest man in our barrack died in weeks. The weakest survived. He never stopped believing he would go home." Death ruled the camps, but survival stories existed too, fragile lights in a landscape of darkness. Still, for most men, there was no miracle, only a grave in the frozen earth, far from home, nameless and forgotten. And yet the cruelty was not only in death itself. It was in the comparisons that haunted every prisoner. The knowledge that their comrades in the West lived like humans while they perished like shadows. That contrast is the next part of our story. For German prisoners, perhaps the most unbearable torment was not just hunger or cold. It was the knowledge of what awaited their comrades elsewhere. They knew that captivity was not the same everywhere. In fact, it was a world divided in two, life in the West and death in the East. By 1944, hundreds of thousands of Germans had surrendered to American forces in France, Italy, and later in Germany itself. Their treatment shocked them, but in a good way. Prisoners were fed rations that, while not luxurious, included bread, meat, potatoes, and sometimes even chocolate. They could write letters home under Red Cross supervision. Many were put to work on farms, where they earned small wages and ate meals with civilians. Some joined educational programs, learning English, or attending lectures to prepare for life after the war. For young soldiers who had grown up under Nazi propaganda, it was surreal. They had been told Americans would execute them. Instead, they found themselves harvesting crops, playing football matches, and even receiving medical care. British camps were stricter, but still humane. German prisoners of war worked in agriculture and rebuilding projects. Food was limited, but no one starved. Many prisoners later recalled fair treatment, even kindness from civilians. In some cases, Germans were shocked to find themselves invited into local homes, sharing tea or bread with the very people whose cities had been bombed. It was a strange reality. The enemy was now a guest worker. In the East, none of this existed. There were no Red Cross letters, no football matches, no wages. Food was starvation rations. Labor was punishment, not rehabilitation. Death was the constant companion. The prisoners who somehow returned from Soviet camps told stories that seemed impossible to those who had spent the war in American or British custody. When one former POW from Siberia described chewing on bark and grass to survive, his comrades in America thought he was exaggerating. When he spoke of thousands dying in a single winter, they shook their heads in disbelief. This contrast created a deep wound in post-war Germany. Two men might have worn the same uniform, fought in the same battles, but their fates diverged entirely depending on where they laid down their weapons. One returned after 2 or 3 years, well-fed, educated, ready to rebuild. The other returned a skeleton a decade later, if he returned at all. Families noticed the difference instantly. Some sons came home strong and healthy, while others never came back. For the mothers and wives of those who vanished in the East, the bitterness lasted for decades. The contrast between East and West also became political. In West Germany, stories of fair treatment by the Allies reinforced the narrative of integration into the Western world. In East Germany, under Soviet influence, the suffering of POWs was silenced, downplayed, or twisted into propaganda about re-education. For the men who lived through it, however, no ideology could erase the truth. The difference was too stark, too brutal. A German soldier captured in France might return to his family in 1947 with stories of farm work and English lessons. A German soldier captured in East Prussia might return in 1955, if he survived, with stories of hunger, corpses, and years lost in frozen forests. It was as if two separate wars had been fought, two separate fates dealt by the roll of a dice. And that cruel divide defined the memory of captivity for an entire generation. Next, we follow those who did survive the East, and the long, painful road that eventually brought them home. For those who survived hunger, cold, and years of labor, captivity did not simply end with the war. In fact, for many, the true ordeal began after 1945. When Germany surrendered in May, countless families expected their husbands, fathers, and sons to return quickly. In the West, this was partly true. American and British authorities began releasing prisoners within months, especially those taken late in the war. By 1947, the majority were home, but for those in Soviet hands, there was no such relief. In 1945, letters from Soviet camps were rare. Families in Germany waited for news that never came. Mothers stood at train stations hoping to see their sons step off. Wives clung to rumors, refusing to believe their husbands were dead. But months turned into years. Thousands of men remained in Siberia, Kazakhstan, the Urals. Some were released in small groups, but most were kept as forced labor for reconstruction. They dug coal in the Donbass, built factories in the Urals, felled timber in Siberian forests. For the Soviet Union, these men were reparations. Every sack of coal they carried, every tree they cut, was a payment for the devastation their army had left behind. By 1947, West Germany was rebuilding under the Marshall Plan. Cities rose from ruins. Former POWs from American and British camps returned to jobs, families, and education. But the Soviet prisoners were still missing. They became a forgotten army. Photographs of them vanished. Official lists were incomplete. In East Germany, under Soviet control, their suffering was politically inconvenient. The government rarely spoke of it, preferring to focus on re-education instead of starvation and death. It was not until 1953, after Stalin's death, that the last large groups of German POWs were released. They returned not as young men, but as broken survivors. Some had spent a decade behind barbed wire. The homecomings were dramatic. Crowds gathered at train stations. Women fainted when they recognized gaunt faces. Children clung to fathers they had never known. Survivors described the shock of stepping into cities that no longer resembled their memories. Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, rebuilt or still scarred from bombing. But not all families were whole. Many returned to find wives remarried, parents dead, or children grown and distant. The war had stolen not just years, but entire lives. In West Germany, survivors sometimes faced suspicion. Some were accused of collaboration, others of exaggerating their suffering. The stigma of surrender and captivity clung to them. In East Germany, the story was twisted for propaganda. Prisoners were described as re-educated anti-fascists, even if they had nearly starved to death. The reality was more complicated. They were not heroes, not traitors, but simply men who had endured the unimaginable. One of the most haunting aspects was the late returnees. Some Germans came home as late as 1955, 10 full years after the war. For them, life had frozen in 1945 and resumed in a completely different world. Konrad Adenauer, the West German chancellor, negotiated directly with Moscow to bring back the final groups. When trains finally arrived, entire towns lined the tracks, welcoming men who had been presumed dead for a decade. For those who survived, freedom was bittersweet. They had escaped the camps, but the scars never left them. The hunger, the deaths, the endless years of labor, all of it remained in their minds, night after night. And so the question remained, what would Germany do with these memories? Would they be remembered or buried in silence? That is the story of our next chapter, legacy and memory. When the survivors finally came home, their ordeal did not immediately become part of Germany's story of the war. For years their voices were silenced by politics, by shame, and by the sheer weight of what they had endured. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Germany was a nation desperate to move forward. Cities had to be rebuilt, economies restarted, families restored. People wanted hope, not horror. The stories of starvation, death, and endless years in Soviet captivity were too painful, too divisive. In West Germany, survivors often kept quiet. They feared being seen as weak or as victims who deserved their fate. Some worried they might even be accused of war crimes themselves. In East Germany, controlled by the Soviets, their suffering was politically inconvenient. The official narrative painted them not as victims, but as men who had been re-educated and turned into good socialists. The reality of men starving in rags burying their comrades by the thousands, did not fit that propaganda, so it was ignored. For the survivors, silence was often easier than speaking. Many returned home gaunt, broken, carrying memories they could not share. Nightmares of hunger and death haunted them. Families noticed that fathers avoided talking about the past. Children grew up sensing a shadow but never hearing the full story. One former prisoner recalled, "When I tried to tell my wife what had happened, she begged me to stop. She said she could not bear to hear it. From that day, I kept it to myself." It was not until decades later, in the 1980s and 1990s, that the experiences of Soviet POW camps began to emerge publicly. As archives open and survivors age, memoirs were published. Historians uncovered documents showing mortality rates, camp conditions, and the vast scope of forced labor. Books, films, and interviews finally gave voice to those who had been silent for so long. Germans were shocked to learn that more than 1 million of their soldiers had perished in Soviet hands. For many, it was the first time they truly understood the scale of the tragedy. In West Germany, recognition came slowly, often tied to reconciliation with the Soviet Union. In East Germany, survivors were forced to fit their experiences into official propaganda. Only after reunification could they tell their real stories openly. Even today, the memory is divided. Some see the suffering as just punishment for Nazi crimes. Others view it as one of the great injustices of the war, a tragedy that claimed men who had already surrendered and laid down their arms. Memorials now stand in some of the places where camps once existed. Survivors' associations keep the memory alive, publishing collections of letters and diaries. In Germany, the forgotten army is no longer forgotten. Their fate is taught in schools, debated in universities, and remembered in families. But for those who lived through it, no monument could erase the hunger, the cold, or the sight of their comrades collapsing beside them. The story of German POWs in Soviet captivity is not just history. It is a reminder of how war continues to punish even after the guns fall silent. The survivors carried their scars into the rest of their lives, and the dead, more than 1 million men, still lie far from home, in unmarked graves across the forests and steppes of the East. Our final chapter will reflect on what this means, not only for the men who suffered, but for how we remember the war itself. The story of German prisoners in Soviet captivity is one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War. It is not a tale of battles won or lost, but of men who had already laid down their weapons, and yet still found themselves fighting for life, day after day, in a war that refused to let them go. For most of Europe, the guns fell silent in May 1945. For the prisoners sent east, the war dragged on for years. Hunger replaced bullets, cold replaced bombs, exhaustion replaced fear of enemy fire. Every sunrise was a new battle: to stand, to walk, to cut timber, to shovel coal. Survival became a victory measured not in medals, but in crumbs of bread. In a sense, these men lived through a second war, one waged not with armies, but with starvation, disease, and despair. And for more than 1 million of them, that war never ended. Numbers tell part of the story. Over 3 million Germans captured by the Soviets, more than 1 million dead. But behind every number was a life, a son who never came home, a father buried nameless in Siberia, a family waiting at a train station for years without an answer. The human cost cannot be measured in statistics alone. It is found in the letters never delivered, the children who grew up without parents, the survivors who carried silence for decades. Perhaps what makes this story most haunting is the contrast. The same uniform, the same war, yet a soldier who surrendered to the Americans might return by 1947, healthy, educated, ready to start over. A soldier who surrendered to the Soviets might return in 1955, broken, scarred, or not at all. This cruel lottery of fate became one of the defining tragedies of the post-war era. It was a reminder that victory and defeat did not end on the battlefield, but lived on in the lives of those who survived. Today, the suffering of German POWs in Soviet camps is remembered more openly. Memorials, books, and films tell their stories. But memory remains contested. Were they victims of injustice or soldiers paying for their own army's crimes? The answer is not simple. What is certain is this: war destroys not only the enemy, but also those who have surrendered. It twists justice into vengeance, survival into punishment, and it leaves scars that last generations. When we think of World War II, we often remember the battles: Normandy, Stalingrad, Berlin. But the fate of the prisoners reminds us that history is not only written on the front lines. It is written in frozen barracks, in cattle cars, in forests where men cut timber until they collapsed. For those men, captivity was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of another. And their story, once silenced, now forces us to confront a hard truth. In war, surrender does not always mean survival.